Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and one of the criticisms that often gets leveled at Tolkien is this idea that everything is black and white in his world, and that the good guys are always good and the bad guys are always pure evil, and there's really no gray. Anybody who's actually read Lord of the Rings knows this is silly. I mean, you definitely have gray characters like Denethor and Boromir, and you've got characters that kind of change sides a little bit, like Saruman, but there's a little more to it than that. I mean, if you even look beyond Boromir, you get other characters who do things in the story that are less than, totally perfect all the time. And so what I wanted to do in this video is take a look at a few of the instances where heroes, not necessarily members of the Fellowship, but certainly people on the good side of the general struggle, do something that is, if not downright mean, at least kind of thoughtless. Some of these are slightly kind of tongue-in-cheek because there's elements of humor in some of them, but all of them, I think, do contain at least some degree of not really doing the right thing. So let's take a look and see when heroes were jerks. Leading us off in this category, we have what may be the most significant move by any of these characters in terms of being a jerk, and that's by Samwise. And I know that sounds weird, like Sam is almost like the perfect guy, but there is this one case, and it really possibly changes the entire rest of the story after this point. Sam and Frodo and Gollum are climbing the stairs of Cirith Ungol, and Frodo and Sam take a nap. Gollum goes off and he does his own thing, and what we can figure out from, later on in the story is that he's going to tell Shelob, by the way, I'm bringing you some nice juicy meat in a little bit, so get ready for it. Frodo and Sam are still asleep when Gollum comes back, and we get this scene where Tolkien describes Gollum looking at these two hobbits, peacefully sleeping next to each other in, great friendship and also peace. And Gollum actually is described as, starting to look more like an old, wizened hobbit himself. Like there's a certain amount of humanity that comes to him, and you almost get the idea. It's not as clear at this stage if you don't know the rest of the story, obviously, because you don't know what's coming. But looking back, what's going on is he's actually struggling with the idea of, do I really want to give these two up? This is the closest we ever see of Gollum really truly wrestling in the book with the idea of changing who he is and kind of a redemptive arc. But then Sam wakes up and he sees Gollum kind of reaching toward Frodo and touching his knee, which the narrator says could almost be a caress. And Sam, seeing this, of course, in his very suspicious nature and, suspicion of Gollum for good reason, to be fair, uh, says, "Where have you been off to? Have you been sneaking?" And of course, in the movie, we get this same kind of scene, but it's not really as clear what's going on in the movie as it is in the book. And the Gollum, of course, takes great offense, and in the book it narrates a bit more and says that, the look that he had just had just vanishes. It's gone beyond recall. And so we know from that that Sam's interruption of his thought process has kind of sealed the deal, and now Gollum is set on his path of betraying Frodo and Sam to the giant spider. So Sam's actions, of course, are completely understandable here, but he does react without thinking in a moment of not really being totally aware of what's going on, and it is unfair to Gollum. And this may not be the only case in which Sam is a little bit unfair to Gollum, but it's possibly the most significant, because had he not done that, how might Gollum's story have ended differently? So I thought that was interesting. And by the way, for future reference, I will not be indicating any moments of good guys being jerks that are clearly ring influenced or anything like that. So it's kind of hard to find any for Frodo, really, that because most of his are ring influenced. So I couldn't really think of one for Frodo. But if anybody can think of one for Frodo that's not ring influenced, mention it in the comments. For the same reason, I will also be avoiding Boromir's ring influenced moments, but I do have one for Boromir, so let's talk about that. Boromir, of course, is the redemption arc within the Fellowship because he kind of starts off kind of on a bad path and ends up, redeeming himself. But a lot of what he ends up doing in the Fellowship is kind of ring influenced, especially towards the end. What we do know is that at the very early parts of his story, he's not ring influenced because he doesn't really know anything about it. And this moment we get is in the Council of Elrond, and he is telling his story. He has this dream, as does Faramir. Faramir actually has it first, and then Boromir has it. And then their father kind of tells him, well, the dream referencing Imladris, that's a reference to Rivendell, so go find Elrond of Rivendell and maybe he can help you out. So he goes up and then tells his dream, and the dream in the book references not just the ring, but also the broken sword of Narsil. It doesn't say Narsil, but it references a broken sword. And he goes north and finds Rivendell, and of course Aragorn is there, and he basically says, well, here's your broken sword. And basically declares himself as the heir of Isildur. And Boromir is kind of like, you don't look like the heir of Isildur. He doesn't say that out loud, but you could tell that's kind of what he's thinking because it says the way he's looking at him looks like probably not. But anyway, Aragorn ends up saying that I will come to Minas Tirith because Aragorn is planning to go to Minas Tirith. Because in the book, he actually plans to take up the kingship because Elrond has basically told him, you can't marry my daughter unless you take up the kingship, so just get over it. So Aragorn in the book is not all, I don't want to do that like he is in the movie. Boromir, at this point, says, well, I didn't come to look for help. I came to find the answer to a riddle. And you could tell that he's being just a little bit too proud of himself and of Gondor here. He does tack on, though we do need the help. And so it's like he's kind of giving a little bit of he's kind of giving some to Aragorn's position, but you could tell that what he's thinking is like, I didn't come up here to ask some wayworn ranger of who knows what lineage for help in my wars. But there is definitely a lot of that pride going on in there, and you can tell that he's, at least at first, not too keen on the idea of Aragorn coming to claim the kingship. Although we do get the idea, especially from Frodo later on, that Boromir does accept Aragorn's claim, because Frodo will end up telling Faramir that Boromir was satisfied of that claim. And of course, when Boromir has his redemption moment and he dies, he will of course be in that position of, accepting Aragorn for who he is. And he will straight up ask him, please make sure Minas Tirith doesn't fall. But at this early moment, he is less informed, certainly, but he's acting on limited information. But at the same time, because he has limited information, he ought to be a little more receptive to things that he might not know already, and he's just kind of like, that's not cool. So that's one of the at least one of the there may be other ones that I'm forgetting, but that's a non-ring influenced moment from Boromir. Since we're on the topic of Aragorn, there's actually one moment from Aragorn that I think is a little bit too high on the pride and haughtiness scale as well. When Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli and Gandalf arrive at Meduseld and they're going to see King Theoden for the first time, the door wardens obviously ask them all to leave their weapons at the door. Legolas and Gimli start disarming themselves, and Aragorn takes his sword and he's like fingering it, saying, I don't think I want to do this. And the guards at that point all kind of like draw their swords, point out, and they're like, then you're not going in. And Aragorn is, Aragorn and Gandalf kind of get into a conversation where Aragorn is basically revealing that he is not looking to put his sword, which is, the serious heirloom, certainly, and a really big deal in the history of Middle Earth. He's not looking to put that in the custody of just some door warden, even if it's at the command of, the king. And, there's this whole back and forth, like the door warden Hama says, you still got to obey the rules of the house. Or maybe it's Gandalf that says that. I may be messing that up. And Aragorn says, I would, even if this was like a poor man's cottage, I would set aside any sword at the door at their request, except this one. And it goes back and forth. And finally, Gandalf prevails upon him to put the sword away. But you get this idea that Aragorn is just a little bit too attached at this stage to his lineage and whatnot. And he even says at one point, I don't see why the will of Theoden should overrule mine, being the heir of Isildur and all that. And you can kind of see where he's coming from, because technically speaking, Rohan is kind of like a loan to the Rohirrim. They came out of the north, and in their history, what happens is they come and save Gondor from an Easterling attack many, many years before all the events of the Lord of the Rings. And the steward, who doesn't have final say, because theoretically they're still waiting for the return of the line of the kings, the steward of Gondor at that point says, well, you can live in this region, which has kind of become depopulated, and you'll be our ally. Aragorn, of course, will end up ratifying that agreement with Éomer later on, after all the events are over. But because of this, technically speaking, Rohan is almost kind of like a subsidiary state in a way. It's not really, but it's kind of subject to the terms of, if Aragorn wanted to, he could renounce that agreement, and then Rohan wouldn't be Rohan. The Rohirrim would have to find somewhere else to live. He wouldn't do that, obviously, but I'm just pointing out that's kind of the position he's coming from, where he does, in a sense, have some authority to say this. But at the same time, it's like, what are you expecting? Do you actually think they're going to run off with your sword, Aragorn? It's really not that. So, I mean, he's just a little bit too caught up in the moment and really cares a little bit too much. Now, the funny thing is, this same scene is where we get Gandalf's big jerk moment too. So let's take a look at that. Now, Gandalf, of course, you could try to pull several different moments, especially moments where he gets grouchy, especially with Pippin, because that happens a few times. But here, I think, is one of the more interesting moments for Gandalf, because here he pretty much straight up lies. Not exactly stating an untruth, but certainly being deceptive about things. After he prevails upon Aragorn to give up his sword, he's like, okay, you happy, Hama? Can we go in now? And Hama basically says, still need your staff. And he goes into this kind of, you almost have to think of Gandalf as being a melodramatic Shakespearean actor in this scene. He's like, this is crazy. This is just discourtesy to rob an old man of his support, and blah, 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 blah. And Aragorn, of course, laughs, because he knows that this is a joke, in a sense. And Aragorn even says everybody has something that they're not willing to give up, but he also appeals to Hama and says, but, won't you let us through? I mean, it's just a stick, and we've all given you our other weapons. Hama does give in, and he basically says, well, he points out that, a stick in the hands of a wizard may be more than a prop for age. But I trust you. I think you're people of goodwill, and in times of doubt, a man must, kind of give his own judgment some sway. And so he lets them in. Now, the reason this is a jerk moment for Gandalf is, A, he had literally just talked Aragorn into giving up his most prized possession, pretty much, which clearly more of a weapon than a staff in some ways. But also, this whole idea of him needing it because he's an old guy and he needs a support, that's garbage. Later on in the story, this doesn't happen in the movie, because I don't know why exactly Jackson didn't do this. He could have done it if he really wanted to, but he probably wanted to feature Pippin more in this scene. But when Gandalf and Pippin go and rescue Boromir, first of all, in the movie, Gandalf gets his staff shattered by the Witch King. That doesn't happen in the book. When he arrives in the book, he still has his staff, or at least it isn't broken. He may not be carrying it at the time, but at any rate, what happens in the movie is that Pippin rolls Boromir off the burning pyre. But in the book, Gandalf goes in there and he literally just picks Boromir up with one hand. And it even says, as an aside, he's revealing the strength that he has in him, because Gandalf is a Maya. He is not a human. He is not just a magical person wandering around. He's not even just an elf. He's way kind of above that power level. He is literally strong enough to just pick Boromir up with one hand and walk out. So this is why Gandalf is a jerk in this scene. He is basically making Hama feel bad for trying to take away his staff when he does not need it at all for the reasons that he is stating that he needs it. So, he kind of needs it, but he doesn't need it for the reason he's saying, and so he's kind of being a jerk. Since we're still in Rohan, let's take a look at Éowyn. Éowyn gets a lot of props for being, a feminist icon and, going out there and doing what the boys do and not taking no for an answer and that sort of thing. I think that's a little overwrought, but the real issue here is something that, again, you don't get in the movies. So if you're not familiar, what happens in the book when Theoden is first getting ready to ride to battle, he's not planning to stop at Helm's Deep in the book, but that's where he ends up. But he's planning to basically just go to the fords of Isen, where he thinks that he still has men holding the fords, and try to mop up the Uruk-hai on the plain with the cavalry. What happens at this point is he's like, I've got to leave somebody here to lead, the people while I'm gone. And he asks, who do my people trust? And they say, well, the House of Eorl. And he's like, but I can't leave Éomer. I need him. And I think it may even be Hama who is kind of speaking for everybody at this point, but whoever it is says, we didn't say Éomer, we said the House of Eorl. We all like Éowyn. She's great. Leave her here. So the people, through whoever the spokesman was, chose to have Éowyn lead them while Theoden is away at battle. So after all the events of Helm's Deep and all this other stuff, they go back to Dunharrow to muster for the ride to Gondor and all this stuff. And Éowyn, of course, will end up disguising herself in order to ride with Theoden. But unlike in the movie where Theoden just kind of tells her, you need to stay here and lead the people while I'm gone, here she's still leading the people because the people literally picked her. They're relying on her as their leader. And so it's a little bit more of a jerk moment when Éowyn deserts them, because all these people who picked Éowyn, and they're like, yay, we have the House of Eorl, even though Theoden and Éomer have to go out and fight orcs and possibly die. They're perfectly happy to have her stay. And then, of course, if Theoden and Éomer get killed in battle, presumably that means she becomes queen, and everybody's fine with that. But so they've all placed their trust in her, and imagine the next day when they wake up and nobody knows where Éowyn is. We don't see this because it's completely off scene, and all we get is actually Theoden's ride and what we see from Éowyn's perspective and that sort of thing. But if we could go back and see what everybody else is thinking, you have to wonder, especially if anybody overheard any of her conversations with Aragorn before he took the Paths of the Dead, are they worried that she went with him or went after him and died in the Paths of the Dead? Or are they worried that, what are they thinking? You don't even know what they're going to think at that point. And so Éowyn has literally put all these people in the position of being like, oh my gosh, how are we going to tell Theoden that we lost Éowyn if he comes back? And so, it's not like the worst thing ever, but it is, she really kind of puts those people in a bad situation, because the Rohirrim have to be worried about her, and also just, now we got to pick another leader. What do we do now type situation. So kind of a jerk moment for her too. Now I've got one more in Rohan, but it's not anybody. It's not the Rohirrim in this case. This time it's Gimli. So Gimli's jerk moment, and there, you could Legolas and Gimli have a little bit of a tiff at the very beginning because dwarves and elves don't get along and all that fun stuff. But I'm not really counting any of that because that has really long and ugly history to it. So my jerk moment for Gimli comes when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli first meet Éomer. And of course, this scene is really interesting. It's much more drawn out in the book than it is in the movie. And in the movie, we get a little bit of the tension between Éomer and Gimli, but the book gives it a whole different context because what we don't see in the movie is any reference to Lothlorien or the Golden Wood or Galadriel or anything like that. In the book, Éomer straight up asks them, "Your clothes look kind of weird. Are you elvish?" And they're like, "No, but we were dressed by the elves." And so Éomer goes off on, "Oh, so there is, a Lady of the Golden Wood, as old stories tell." And he goes off and makes kind of a not too charitable comment about the witchery of what goes on in the wood. And of course, Gimli, who is now the most devoted of all Galadriel devotees, goes off and says, "You speak out of ignorance, and I should teach you better manners." And you could again kind of see where Gimli is coming from here, because he is defending the perfectly good character of a person that he is now extremely devoted to in some sense. But at the same time, it's like he didn't have to straight up call Éomer ignorant and kind of insult him in front of his men, and also in a situation where Éomer could clearly just kill them all. So, Gimli gets points for being chivalrous and trying to defend his lady, but he kind of loses some points for being a little bit too reckless in that regard. It's very, very Arthurian chivalric, and so it's really cute, but it's kind of unnecessary and dangerous. So that's kind of the best I could come up with for Gimli. Speaking of Gimli, now let's look at Legolas. So Legolas we don't see a whole lot of in terms of conversation. He really doesn't have a lot of speaking lines in the book at all. Some of them are kind of expositional, like when he and Gimli tell the story of passing through the paths of the dead. And also at the very beginning of when we see him at the Council of Elrond, he explains what has happened to Gollum and all that sort of thing and why he's even there at the council. But there is an interesting line that we get when they're trying to climb over Caradhras. And the interesting thing here is Legolas is described as being dressed in much less wintry clothing than the rest of the group. They're all wearing heavy boots, cloaks, and all this stuff, and it's like he's still wearing more or less the same woodland green garb, and he's wearing these light shoes. And he's also even described as, and this is accurate in the movie too, they actually got this in the movie, which I think is really cool, he's walking on top of the snow because he's an elf and he can do that. Everybody else is so heavy and whatever that they're just trudging through the snow, and he's just like doo, 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 walking on top of it like, yeah, this is nothing. So anyway, they get to a point where they're in really dire straits, and it looks like they might be trapped and they might all freeze. And Legolas ends up saying something along the lines of, well, if Gandalf could just use his magic and start us a fire, that would be really cool. And Gandalf testily replies, and if elves could find the sun, then they could bring it here and warm us up. Because what Legolas is doing here is cracking a joke. Legolas is cracking a joke. And if you really pay attention throughout The Lord of the Rings, you may notice that elves crack a lot more jokes than you would expect. We think of elves as being these really serious and somber and wise beings, but we can see them in The Lord of the Rings being quite silly. But here Legolas is, everybody else around him is just miserable, freezing, and they're all in peril of dying, and he's, and as an elf, just super hardy and not really fazed by much of anything, and he's cracking jokes at their expense. It's like, it may not be the most tactful thing to do, Legolas. So, that's kind of the only thing I could think of. There might be another one that works, but that's kind of all I could find. So my final entry for this video is Faramir. Boromir is my favorite character probably in The Lord of the Rings. I think he's awesome, and they totally ruined him in the movie. But you almost get the impression from the book that his only real flaw is daddy issues. Like, he wants too much to live up to his father's expectations and errs on that side sometimes. He even says in a conversation with Denethor, with Gandalf present, after he explains what's happened with Frodo and Sam, he's like, "I wish I had had your, your input in making this decision." And Denethor responds, "Nah, you would have chosen the same thing anyway. I know you too well." Um, and anyway, in the course of this conversation, Denethor, as he does, tends to wander towards the topic of, man, if Boromir had been there. And here's where Faramir actually does something that's a little bit out of line. He says, let me remind you that on one occasion, at least, your counsel did prevail, and that's when Boromir got to go north to Rivendell. He doesn't say that explicitly, but that's clearly what he's referring to. And, obviously it's easy to sympathize with Faramir here because Denethor is always putting Boromir up as the good brother and the one who does what he's supposed to do, and Faramir is just the meh. But Faramir here is literally throwing Boromir's death in Denethor's face, saying, if you had just let me go instead, Boromir might have actually still been here, and me too. So, there is a sense, of course, in which his comment is justified, but the way he does it is just like slapping Denethor in the face with Boromir's death, and it's a little bit on the cruel side. Certainly, Faramir has been on the bad side of a lot of similar cruelty going the other way, and so it's kind of payback. But Boromir died, and Faramir had never been attacked with anything quite that serious, and so it's a little bit unfair, although, again, we can certainly sympathize. So, those are my counts of instances where heroes in The Lord of the Rings were jerks to other people. Like I said, some of them kind of tongue-in-cheek. There's several characters I couldn't think of any good examples for. Merry, Pippin, that sort of thing. I mean, you might find a couple that are kind of really on the silly end of the spectrum. But if any of you can think of really good examples of heroes being jerks in The Lord of the Rings that I haven't thought of, please do mention them in the comments. Might be some interesting discussion fodder. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can get some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. I'm at JRRTLore, and you can subscribe to the channel here, you can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.